Erev Tov, welcome back. So before we start our actual class, I want to share with you some thoughts. I want to talk to you about the first person who believed in me as a young adult. You see, when you're little kids, everybody believes in you. Then you start talking and you lose half your friends because nobody likes when you start talking and you have opinions. And then the next phase happens normally as a teenager. All the people who thought, oh, you're so nice, you're so cute and so sweet, suddenly they can't deal with your moods. They can't deal with your questioning everything. They can't deal with that you have a personality that's different. Tonight, the 27th of Tevet, is the passing of the Askara, the yahrzeit of my uncle, Rabbi Shlomo Kupitz, Alav HaShalom ben Pesach. And I want to share with you a little bit, and I think it fits a lot into our Ḥachamim class. My uncle, through marriage, he was married to my aunt, and if I don't know that I could sum him up in a word, but I want to describe him to you. You know the people who like everybody who's chashuv? There's a rabbi in town, of course, I want to host them. There's somebody popular, yeah, let them be my guest. Most people are like that. Not my aunt and uncle. If you walked into an average day into my aunt and uncle's house, there was always somebody strange from the neighborhood there that came to eat, that came to drink. Shabbat took its cake. You looked around their table, and they had what I would call all the rejects. Everybody that didn't make sense elsewhere landed up on their table. So I'll give you an example. The person who sat right next to my uncle, his name was Chamish. Chamish had a big, big beard, long hair, and he was a plumber in New York City. The minute my uncle made kiddush, he worked very hard. The minute my uncle made kiddush, Chamish would start snoring. But not snoring. This sounded like a train. From when the meal started all the way to the end. My uncle never said a word. Quite to the contrary. People would always say, you're such a respectable rabbi. It doesn't make sense. I said, what doesn't make sense? You're a bunch of fakers. You like the titles, and you like the people who come with positions, and you come with money. I hate those people. In fact, there are many family members of mine who didn't like him because of that, because he didn't play games. If you were an honest person and you were a good person, he loved you. And if you weren't, he was not afraid of you. It didn't matter how much money you have. It didn't matter what grand rabbi title you wore. He would make fun out of his window. I'm not going to name which Bet HaKnesset. But across the street from him was one of the very big Bate Knesset in Borough Park. And he would laugh. He said, oh, look, there goes the rabbi with his fuzzy fur coat. And he would say it mockingly, because a rabbi with a lot of fuzzy fur coats and very little compassion for his own Hasidim. And my uncle couldn't be more different. He loved everything. What do I mean by everything? If you ever went on a trip with him, it would take hours because he loved flowers. He loved birds. His favorite flower was the bird of paradise. And he could tell you stop at anything. He could tell you everything about everything, because his view of the world was it's not a bunch of fragmented pieces. How could it be that if I'm a scholar, that I also don't know HaKadosh Baruch Hu's world? How could I not know botany and science and zoology and astrology and philosophy? And he wasn't afraid. He wasn't afraid to engage in everything. And I think more than what he loved as far as nature, he really loved people. He really thoroughly enjoyed just sitting around with people. I remember his Shabbat meals would take hours. He was an Am Shenaver Chassid. So if you know anything about Am Shenav, and for example, the Am Shenaver Rebbe starts Shabbat at almost regular time, but on Tuesday morning, he's still doing Mincha of Shabbat. Yeah, they have cycles. Who keeps up with his minyan? Because people can't stay for that many days. But that's how it works. You want to know about the Am Shenaver Rebbe? A couple of years ago, more than a couple, he was marrying off his son in Israel. And he put out invitations all over the walls of Yerushalayim. And he said, I'm inviting all of Am Yisrael. Everybody in the Jewish nation should come celebrate with me. Because how could it be I'm going to make a celebration and it's only the fancy people and the rich people and the ones who paid enough money? I want everybody. And in that sense, my uncle was a real chassid. He was somebody who genuinely believed in people. You would look around this table, and while he's sharing his Divrei Torah and his arguments, and he's not afraid, at his table, you could bring anything up. There was not one subject you couldn't touch, period. And he always had, Chesky, this is you, he loved his wild turkey. I think, is that what it's called? He used to have a shot of that. He had all different kinds of bourbons he used to like to drink. And he would make jokes. And his jokes were hilarious. And he would laugh and he would cry. And he wasn't afraid to emote. He wasn't afraid to be a human being. And I think I saw this the most when it came to interacting with his wife. He loved my aunt. What do I say, loved? He loved her. He would write poems to her. He would sit at everything they did was together. Their life mission was together. This was not a couple that she did one thing, he did another. Together they would host and they would bake and they would cook. And don't think, they didn't live in a fancy house. My aunt and uncle, they could have gotten onto programs because they were legitimately poor. What do I mean by program? Government help. But he said, I understand, I have everything I need. I make a salary. Why should I take from the government something that they could give other people? So he lived in an apartment building his entire life. You know, the sky-rise apartments in New York, you come in and it smells like urine and weed. That's where he lived. He said, I don't need anything else. I have 2 bedrooms, a kitchen. What else do I need? And my first conversation with him as a young adult, I said, you know, Shlomo, I have so many ideas. I want to change the world. I see so many problems. Where do I start? He said, start learning, for goodness sake. And I was so insulted. What do you mean? I've been in school my whole life. And he went over to his bookshelf and he pulled out some books. He said, you ever read these? I said, no, I didn't know girls could read them. And he looked at me and he said, that is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Anybody with a brain can read them. And I really took it to heart. Anybody with a brain can learn. And that was something he encouraged consistently. He was a Magid Shiur. He taught post-high school students in the Boston Yeshiva for over 20 years. He always said, my favorite students are the ones who everybody hates because they are the most real people. And he would go with them and he would take them to Coney Island at night and they would sit and they would talk and they would, in his younger years, and they would smoke cigars. And I'm reading now in the WhatsApp group that I'm a part of how many dozens of his students today are successful human beings. They said, because somebody believed in me. Somebody told me, you could be greater. Why in the world are you limiting yourself? And when I'm talking about Ḥachamim, my feeling is that this is somebody who would be very proud to see us here because he would feel very much at home here in Shiviti. In fact, one of my last conversations I had with him was he was very sick. After my aunt passed away, you know what it says? Ki cholat ahava ani, I'm lovesick for you. When my aunt passed away, my uncle stopped functioning. He could not live without her, and ultimately he passed away just a few years later. He passed away from cancer, lo aleinu, but I believe he died from a broken heart. And I came to his house and he had throat cancer and he really couldn't talk. And I said, you know, I'm dating this guy and I really love him. I think he's somebody I want you to meet. And he said to me, well, what do your parents say? I said, well, you know, I don't know. He said, is this somebody who's going to be your soulmate? I said, I think so, for sure. He said, is this somebody that you're going to build a beautiful home and be able to do all the good things that you dream of doing in Am Yisrael? I said, 100%. He said, then Vori, there's nothing for you to look back on. Run with it. Eventually, your parents are going to learn how to dance. And unfortunately, I did not have the opportunity to bring my husband up to my uncle. He had passed away quite suddenly. But I want to say, Lilu Nishmato, that the learning that we do tonight should be in his merit, because really my trajectory of realizing, you know, I have a brain. And why shouldn't I use it? Because if HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave it to me, he only gave it to me on condition that I use it. I use it to do good things. And I'm blessing us all. Find that person in your life, or be that person in your life who sees another human being and says, you look like you need somebody to pick you up. The other people, they don't need you to pick them up. They're already full of hot air. Who cares about them? Look for the person who's downtrodden. The person who sits at your table and snores the entire time through because they're working so hard. The person who for years and years can't find their place because they fit nowhere. Find that human being and lift their spirits. Bezrat Hashem, this should be a zechut for his neshama. On that note, let's start our shiur. You know, they say there was once a guy, because all the good stories happen on trains between Pinsk and Minsk and somewhere in Europe. And they're sitting on a train, and not like today where nobody talks to anybody. He looks over at the guy sitting near him. He says, "You Jewish?" The guy looks at him and says, "No." 10 minutes later, he looks at him again. "You Jewish?" "I told you no." 30 minutes into the 7-hour train ride, he looks at him and he says, "You Jewish?" I said, "Stop. No." An hour later, he nudges him. "Psst. You sure you're not Jewish?" I said, "Stop. I already told you I'm not Jewish." 3 hours in, he elbows him on the other side. He says, "Tell me, your mother's Jewish?" So I told you I'm not Jewish. 6 hours into the train ride, he elbows him on both sides. He says, "Tell me, you sure you're not Jewish?" Guy looks at him. He says, "I told you I'm not Jewish." And then he looks again. He says, "Fine, you're right. I'm Jewish. What do you want?" And the guy who keeps asking, he says, "It's funny. You don't look Jewish." And I think that's today's class, which is, what does it mean to look Jewish? What are we evaluating it by? I want to first talk to you about what it isn't, and then what it is. Particular to, we're talking about Ḥachamim. What makes somebody a Ḥacham? What doesn't make them a Ḥacham? But first I'm going to start with a doesn't, then with a does, and then with a doesn't again. So let's start. I want to read to you from Ḥacham for a few different pieces. In addition to his infinite wisdom, you will find his infinite humor laced between his words. So here you have a very interesting passage he writes in his Forbidden Meditations. If you have the book, it's in chapter 3, page 1207, the second half. For those of you who do not have the book or are unfamiliar, you want to get yourself a copy on Amazon. Even if you're going to need to break your head when reading it, you should still have a copy of this book. Ḥacham Devorah says, assimilation is the greatest danger haunting Jews. It is tricky and sneaky and hard to detect. It penetrates the individual from within, taking hold of his patterns of thoughts and feeling. Once his inner mechanism is overtaken by the pagan world around him, the Jew retrogresses to mythical thinking and is unable to detect the metamorphosis going on within, and least of all to realize that what he imagines to be Jewish has nothing to do with the Torah. I'm going to pause this over here. Ḥacham Devorah says, in Yiddish there's an expression. Ḥacham Devorah does not say this. In Yiddish we say, "Azoi vi segoyish sich, siyiddish sich." Just like the trends in the non-Jewish world happen, that's how the same trends happen in the Jewish world. Maybe a little bit slower. For example, now the Jewish world is all baking sourdough bread. But guess what? 20 years ago, the world around them was also baking sourdough bread, but it took some time until it became a Jewish item. Ḥacham Devorah says the danger of assimilation is it happens so slowly, you don't recognize it. Day by day by day, outside culture comes, and the first day you're appalled. What? How could that be? And the next day you're tolerant of it, and the third day you're already celebrating it because, wow, you think it's the best thing that ever happened. And what happens is when outside ideas take over our own thinking, we don't anymore think like Jews. We lose our ability to critically say, wait, is this really a Jewish value? Is this really what the Torah and mitzvot stand for? Or is this just me parroting a lie that slowly made its way in, slowly came through me, and now the packaging looks Jewish, but if I peeled away the layers and opened it, it's nothing more than a cheap imitation that I took away from the non-Jewish world. Hold that thought, and I want to take you to a poem that Ḥacham Devorah talks about. Now, for those of you in Kilat Ḥachamim, you may have heard this poem before, because Ḥacham Yonatan read it to us on Sukkot. For those of you not, you're going to hear it again. Again, if you have the book, it's going to be on page 538. The chapter is called The Day of the Willow. What is the Day of the Willow? When do we take willows? Hanan? Yafa, Hoshana Rabbah. Hoshana Rabbah. On Hoshana Rabbah, He's going to now record to us a poem that was written by Rabbi Shemuel Hanagid. Elchanan and Avinom both have a book on Rabbi Shemuel Hanagid. Please tell us a little bit about who he was.
The general of the Muslim army, and he was the Jewish advisor to the king.
Yeah.
And his
Yafeh, yafeh. We're going to one day learn about Rabbi Shemuel Hanagid, but suffice it to say that he lived in Spain and was a real Ḥacham, so didn't just know Torah, but was so well-rounded that the king's army said, we need you on our team. And he spearheaded many efforts in the infantry and the soldiers, and unfortunately ultimately gets killed. But what we have is a lot of his poems preserved. He records what he sees as one of the strangest incidents that happened to him when he's walking down the street. And I want to read to you. The first recorded clash between a Maimonidean and an anti-Maimonidean took place in the early 11th century in Andalusia in Spain. He writes, it was the day of the willow, Hoshana Rabbah, a ceremony celebrated on the 7th day of Sukkot at the end of the summer. On that day, Jews perform an ancient rite with a willow branch. Rabbi Shemuel Hanagid and a friend were on their way to the morning services when they heard shrieking noises coming from the synagogue. Thinking that some people were desecrating the place, they came in. They passing by the Bet HaMidrash, and they hear crazy noises coming out. Their assumption is there must be vandals, there must be bad people. They come in. Perhaps someone was using the sanctuary to shelter his donkey or his cattle. They asked, no, they were told. But a rabbi is giving a class in Talmud. Entering the sanctuary, they saw the teacher, attired in rabbinic robes and related paraphernalia, fringes on the four corners of the garment, a beard, a hat, as if the habits would make a sage. So here they thought they're coming into some kind of chaotic scene of vandals. They walk in, they see a prototype rabbi standing over there in front. How do you know it's a rabbi? Because he's dressed like a rabbi. He's wearing a hat, he's wearing a robe, he's wearing tzitziot. Teachers and students were shaking their heads, yelling the text and mispronouncing every single word. Sporadically, the teacher would interrupt their reading in the middle of a word, offering some bombastic and long-winded explanation. So he comes in, he sees somebody who obviously is wearing the costume of a rabbi, and everybody's doing very crazy movements. So they're shaking and they're moving and they're yelling, and every so often the rabbi stops them in the middle of reading the text, and he gives them some outlandish explanation about what the text is actually saying. So here comes Rabbi Shemuel Hanagid. I greeted the rabbi respectfully. He answered me belligerently, as if I were a foe. He says, I came, and I gave kavod, like normal Ḥachamim do. I came to the rabbi, I smiled at him. I warmly greeted him. What's the rabbi's response to me? What do you want from me? I know you? Ḥacham Or stops over here and he says, let's try to analyze this story. What is going on? You know, they give you sometimes like Wacky Wednesday, you know, Dr. Seuss's book, and you have to find what's wrong on the page. Ḥacham Or is going to do that for us now, which is what is wrong with this story? From A to Z, there's nothing that makes sense, but let's take apart why it doesn't make sense. Let us consider some of the faults that the author attributed to these bogus Talmudists. This is a key term for people who think they know a little bit of Torah, but really they're not rooted at all in any tradition. Number one, firstly, they regard themselves as superior. The root resh, hey, bet in the opening line of Rabbi Shemuel Hanagid's poem is a word that means lordship, hierarchy, superiority. The first thing wrong is it doesn't make sense. You bump into another human being, and the first thing that they exude to you is, I'm better than you. You ever meet those people? You don't even know me. And already you have to turn your nose up and pretend that somehow you're a better human being than me. It's a horrible midah. The second thing he says that they are gullible and gluttons. In our cases, these attributes are interrelated. Rabbi Shmuel HaNagid describes this Ḥacham as somebody who was both a glutton and very gullible. Now let's take it apart. What is the connection between the two? What does it mean when somebody's gullible?
Gullible, they're like very easy to like also.
Yafeh. Aaron, you have your hand up? What does it mean? Yafeh mod. Avinon, what did you want to add? Yafeh mod. Shlomo Melech says, Peti yamin lekol davar. Only a fool believes everything. Now, what's the connection between the gullible person and somebody who's gluttonous? What's a glutton? Aaron, what's a glutton? Somebody who takes 6 of those candies instead of 1. No. Yeah? A glutton is somebody who overeats, so not 2. I didn't say 2. Right? In our case, these attributes are interrelated. He said there's a connection here. Why? Because they are naive. You see, the idiot, and now he's going to, Rabbi Shmuel HaNagid is very pointedly mocking this rabbi. They take rabbinic agadot in their most literal sense, particularly the ones speaking about the banquet awaiting the pious in the beyond. So we know that in the Agadah, it tells us that Bezrat Hashem, there's going to be a Sudah at the end of days. And you ever heard about the Sudat Leviathan? There's a whole song.
Yes.
Very good. Thank you. Yum, yum. Very good, Elchanan. That at the end of the days, and they're going to sit and they're going to eat. In fact, there's a Yiddish song. What are we going to be eating over there? What kind of food? What kind of wine is going to be served? Oh. Yafeh. So Ḥacham V'or says you have these foolish rabbis who, because they have no tradition and they have no ability to learn, they read this Agadah. For them, savoring food, and with it the whole gamut of human sensuality, stands for the highest level of human experience. You have to understand. Our Ḥachamim are trying to tell us something about the end of time, something about the afterlife that is so profound. And these stupid fools who call themselves rabbis, the only thing they could think is, it literally says we're going to have a Suda. Must be we're going to the 5-star Michelin restaurant. Must be we're going to get the most sensual pleasure, kind of like the Muslims, right? You're going to go to Allah and you're going to get all the virgins. How stupid could you be? Do you think that the highest level of holiness, right? Game over. And now what's the end gift? A chocolate bar. Does that make sense? It makes sense maybe if you're 5, but it doesn't make sense if you're sophisticated. He says, later, Maimonides would be attacked for proposing that the rabbis never intended a gastronomical banquet. Right? The Rambam says, of course it can't be something that's going to fill your stomach. For the anti-Maimonidean, faithful, denial of a gastronomical banquet in heaven equals heresy. You would tell that to this bogus rabbi. He says, Chas v'shalom, but Ḥachamim said we're having a feast. How could you say we're not having a feast? When you come to think about it, what could the purpose of all the earthly tribulations be without a positive assurance of the most succulent banquet you can imagine? For the fool, suffer all day. Because at night when I'm going to come home, there's going to be warm food on the table, and I'm going to be able to eat, and I'm going to be full. Yeah, that's normal for an average person. But when we're talking about holy, when we're talking about end goals of the life, could it really be that that's the ultimate reward we're working towards? Guys, work hard for 120 years because at the end, you're going to be able to eat a stuffed goose. You think that's what the Ḥachamim really meant? On the other hand, for the Gaonim, to take the Agadot in their plain meaning would be like interpreting a painting of some Salvador Dali or Jackson Pollock in the manner of a border inspector taking a passport photo. Yeah, he says, imagine you took a beautiful painting and you gave it to a border agent. And he says, I see a stamp and I see the barcode. He said, you fool, there's a picture. Push it back a minute. Of course, you're right. There is a picture. There are numbers. There's a barcode. That's not what the picture is. If you take it back a little bit and you broaden your horizon, you're going to understand the depth, the beauty, and not just the detail over there that negates the whole picture. By associating gluttons with gullible, the author was pointing out their immediacy. They are gullible because their thoughts are governed by sensual gratification and vice versa. You see, this Ḥacham, who pretends to be a Ḥacham, he's nothing more than an unsophisticated human being. Because if you know anything about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? He makes a triangle, and the most base need a human being needs for survival, food and shelter. But would you say that that's the only thing human beings need? Of course not. As we grow, we need human connection. We need to matter in the world. We need purpose, right? Our needs become more sophisticated. But here you have somebody who purports to be a rabbi, and they're so unsophisticated that the only reward they could think about is sensual gratification. Fill my stomach, bring me the virgins. What kind of crazy rabbi is this? You're supposed to understand the depth of the Torah, and the only thing you can think about is your stomach and any other base pleasure. Another problem. So here you have something very interesting. We talked about this once. The relationship between the stupider you are, somehow the haughtier you are. Yeah? So the people with very big egos sometimes have very low IQs because they don't match up. He says over here you find they are haughty. This is a reference to the arrogance peculiar to bogus Talmudists because they measured themselves by the endorsement they received from ignoramuses. Shaking their heads erratically, they believed themselves to be superior to Rav Haigon. For them, he would barely qualify as Ziba, a deceitful servant of King Shaul's house. You see, they're such fools. But who do they surround themselves with? Bigger fools. We watched a video recently, a tiny YouTube clip. There's this, I don't know if I can call him even a rabbi. Wherever he goes, he walks around with a camera recording himself, and then he puts it online. So he's taking a recording where he's saying nonsense, and the person sitting near him passes him a note. And he looks at the note, and it was obviously a critique on what he's saying. So he turns to the guy near him. He says, "Don't you ever stop me in the middle of my speech? Don't you ever critique me? Don't you know I never prepare my lectures? I just sit here and I get downloads straight from heaven. So how could you even critique what I'm saying?" And he realized, I don't know who the greater fool is, the teacher or the student who didn't get up and walk out that door and never come back in. But this rabbi, this prototype of Ḥacham, he surrounds himself with fools who nod their heads and they smile. Wow, that was so deep. What was so deep? The big black hole that he just put you into. That's what's so deep. I have this in the world of academia a lot. You have some people who are very intelligent, and then you have people who are so stupid, but they write things so cryptically that you're busy scratching your head and you don't want to look like the idiot. So you say, wow, that was so intelligent. It was so intelligent, even I don't understand what I'm reading. Next. For these people, appearance is everything. It would suffice for someone to wear rabbinic apparel to have these men believe him to be qualified to head of the yeshiva. You see, over here, it's all about the show. It has nothing to do with what's going on inside. So if you take a fool and you dress him up with a long robe and a hat and you tell him to grow his beard, he's the best candidate for chief rabbi. Because what are the qualifications? Nothing. You just needed the best costume. The Ramchal, Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, warns against this when he talks about the mitchazdim. He talks about the people who they're not real chasidim, they're not really pious. They put it on like a costume. But the problem is we live in a world where the costume matters so much that people will worship the costume and never check beneath it. So much so that if you're not wearing the right costume, you could be the greatest rabbi in the world. You will not be treated with an ounce of respect, an ounce of seriousness. Why? How could he be a rabbi? You ever saw what he dresses like? The lunacy. He continues. They're insensitive to grammar. So that, quote, the Talmud they study is a fabrication of their gibberish. In the course of this chapter, we will see that there are other, more sinister aspects to linguistic gibberish. Later on, he expands on this idea, but he says, you find something also unique about these fools. They don't actually care what the text says. They don't know the nuance of the language. They don't care to know the nuance in the language. And the problem is, you see, if you make up one word or two words and it doesn't matter, so it doesn't matter. But if you believe that this is the book of the creator of the world and that every letter and every dot either will build the world up or destroy it, of course grammar matters. Of course pronunciation matters. But you have a whole genre of people who call themselves rabbis. They don't care about the grammar. They don't care about the text. and the errors they make. I have a sister who I spoke to today. She was once observing a class where somebody was giving, they call them model lessons. She wanted to see if she could be a teacher for this class. So she decided to teach them Pirkei Avot, and she was teaching them what was created on Erev Shabbat, right? And in Pirkei Avot, it says different things were created on Erev Shabbat. Now, clearly, this girl did not know how to read because she looked into the text and she says, oh, it's tzvas. Thinking of Ashkenazi action. Af tzvas betzvas. Asta be'erev Shabbat. And she went on to give an entire lesson how the city Tzvat was created on Erev Shabbat. Now that sounds like a really nice lesson, except if you go into Pirkei Avot, it doesn't say that. Safta, what does it actually say?
Tzvat is something that we hold stuff with.
Ah, very good. The word is Tzvat, and it's a tweezers. Okay, something like a tongs, a tweezers. The problem is here stood a fool in front of an entire class teaching them how the city of Tzvat is so holy, and that's why it was created on Erev Shabbat. Nonsense of nonsense of nonsense. But the worst part is, all the students. Oh, that's a good question. I don't know why the tweezers. The students, the people who sit there and they're nodding and saying, wow, I just went to a class on the Kabbalah. Of what? Of the lies? Of the shekel? 15. He says the teacher is poorly mannered and bellicose. This is symptomatic of the violence peculiar to the anti-Maimonidean notion of devotion. Thus, whereas the disciples of sages bring peace, not only amongst Jews, but also the world, bogus Talmudists are perennially attacking somebody. Goyim, other Jews, and when no one else, each other, beginning at home. This is something so important. So important. You want to know, we have simanim. How do you know if a fish is kosher? Fins and scales, right? Fins and scales. And how do you know if an animal's kosher? Choose its cut and split hooves. How do you know if a bird is kosher? Nah, it's a trick question. You need a myself. Yeah, you need the right. You need the OU list. We have simanim when it comes to food. We also have simanim when it comes to how to tell, is this a real Ḥacham or is this a charlatan? One of the easiest ways to tell, no, this is a faker, is by his mannerisms. A real Talmid Ḥacham, it says in Tana de Be'aliyahu, that our Ḥachamim marbim shalom ba'olam. Scholars, sages, they bring peace, they increase peace in the world. And my father-in-law always says, really, there should be a question mark at the end. Ḥachamim marbim shalom ba'olam? Which scholars do you know bring peace? I only know the ones who fight and they sue each other in court and they're busy going on scandals and smear campaigns. Shem Yishmor. A real Ḥacham, you know them just by the interaction you have. You meet them, it already feels good. You walk away from that conversation feeling happier, feeling calmer, feeling more loved, feeling that the world's okay. It's a better place. And then you meet the other bogus Ḥacham, who the minute you bump into him, already you're feeling antsy, already you're feeling nervous. You don't even know why. But they're angry. They spew hatred. They like to divide everybody. Nothing is good. The lens that they see the whole world is bad. They're busy telling you how this is the worst thing and that's the worst thing. And they always need an enemy. So either the enemy is going to be the non-Jew, or it's going to be the other type of Jew who doesn't fit, is not good enough, is worse than us. And if they've already exhausted those options, so then they start fighting with their own people. Their wives, their children, their congregants. But the person, by definition, doesn't matter how much Torah he knows. You bump into him, and already you feel at an unease. That's the siman. This is not a real Ḥacham. This is bogus. Doesn't matter what costume he's wearing. Let me take you to the Hilchot Rambam. So what is a Ḥacham? Right? If I just shared with you what's not a Ḥacham, maybe we could learn a little bit of the halachot. What is a Ḥacham? For those of you who have your phones, and if you'd like to, you can go to Sefaria. Oh, thank you. The link is in the Google Classroom. I want to give a special shout out to not just my Ḥacham and partner, but also all the technical stuff, aside for the book that we forgot at home today. Really, it all happens because Ḥacham Yonatan does it. That's the truth. All the technology, and I'm going to give a shout out over here. also to Yitzchak, because all the classes that you get to see online is B'schut Yitzchak, and I bless him, Bezrat Hashem, with a lot of good things, and especially a good wife. So if you're going to go into, it's going to be, okay, we have the link. If you go into Safari, you'll see in Hilchot Deot, Perek Hey. So the 5th chapter.
Next is going to be next year when he has a wife. Maybe she didn't hear this class that you blessed him with a wife.
And already it happened. That's right. Then I'm going to bless him with a baby. All right? One step at a time. Okay, so we're in the 5th chapter of Hilchot Sefer Hamadah, Hilchot Deot. The Rambam gives us the halachot, the hitnagut talmidei chachamim. 2 reasons. One is, if you're an aspiring Talmid Chacham, you better know this chapter very, very well, right? What am I aspiring to be? What are the things I should adopt, and what are the things that are absolute nonsense? So in this chapter, you're not going to find anywhere that you should take vigorously when you pray. Guess why? It's not a criteria for being Talmid Chacham. Yeah, nowhere are you going to find the criteria that your beard needs to touch your toes and it has to be very bushy. Guess why? Because it's not one of the criteria. And so on and so forth. So it's important for the people who want to be Talmidei Chachamim to be able to learn this. But more importantly is for us lay people. Because we will bump into so many people in the world who tell us, learn from me. I want to teach you. I want to inspire you. I want to lecture you. And we have to be able to discern and say, well, is this somebody I want to learn from? Are you somebody that is licensed according to the regulations of what it means to be a chacham to even open your mouth? What is the criteria that you need for me to say, yeah, this is somebody I want to learn Torah from? This is who I want to subscribe to when I want to learn a text. So I want to look at the first, let's look at the first halakha. The Rambam says, Keshem shahachacham nikar b'chokhmato ובדעותיו, והוא מובדל בהן משאר העם, כך צריך שיהיה ניכר במעשיו. So just like the Chacham, you're able to spot his wisdom because the way he thinks and his intelligence is superior to others. So too, his behavior, his mannerisms, his persona has to also be different. So this is where I'm going to settle a dispute that I always have with my husband. There's a certain person who I believe has tremendous wisdom, but I don't consider him a Talmid Chacham because his midot are non-existent. And over here, the Rambam is telling us that just like it's easy, it's easy to tell somebody's intelligence just by when they open their mouth. In fact, that's why it's better when some people keep their mouth shut, because at least then they leave you in this limbo of maybe they're smart and maybe they're not. But the minute they open their mouth, they guarantee, now I know you're not, right? The flip side is also true. You sometimes listen to somebody say, wow, there's so much chokhmah here. There's so much wisdom. Everything they say, the intelligence is obvious. The Rambam says, so the same thing has to be in their behaviors. It has to be that when you look at their behaviors, it is different than the average person you bump into. Their behaviors have to also be superior. How? B'machalo u'b'mashkeho. The way he eats, the way he drinks. And I grew up in a house where we never ever went to restaurants, ever. It's only today I realize, now this is interesting because the Rambam is talking about behaviors for Talmidei Chachamim, which means the things he says are for a certain class of people. The layman does not have to follow these laws. Yes, we talked about this today. The Shulchan Aruch then ends up codifying all these laws that should have been distinctions for Chachamim for the lay people, which is interesting because then the lay people don't do it and neither do the Chachamim in some capacity. But I grew up in a house where, and I've seen this also by my in-laws, where, so for example, we never went to eat out, but even when we ate in the house, if we ever had a pizza come to the house, my mother always would tell them when they deliver, please make sure you cut it into 16. Because how could it be that you're going to take a slice, and this is what you're going to do. You're going to stretch your mouth this big. You ever see when they throw it into the hippopotamus, they put a watermelon in? That's how some people look when they're eating pizza. A Talmid Chacham, they don't eat like that. So my father, when he eats his fruits, I've never seen my father bite into a fruit. I'm not telling you I'm like that. There's something about biting into an apple or biting into a peach. But he always uses a knife and he cuts it into pieces that are sizable food. Because who eats like that? B'mashkeo, the way he drinks. Forgive me, I once went to somebody's house. It was a very sweet couple, and we were having a great conversation. And then the husband was unfortunately very, very large. The wife brought him a cup. It wasn't a cup. I never saw a cup like this. You see, this is like a normal size cup. This was a cup. Actually, I did see. They have them for the big Slurpees. What do they call those? Big gulp cups?
Oh, the big ones.
I've never seen that in my life before. So it was something twice that size. And he took 2 seltzer bottles like this. He poured them in, and she brought him a big straw, and he started drinking. I remember thinking to myself, where's the dignity? Umashkeho, by the way he drinks. Ubebilato ubasiyat tzerachav. He says, even the way he's a Talmid Ḥacham, the way he's with his wife, in his intimate relationship, how he interacts with his spouse, how he takes care of his needs. He showers, he uses the restroom. It's different. It can't be just like everybody else because there's a higher level of sensitivity, of sophistication that has to be obvious in the way they talk to each other. Chas v'shalom, we're not even talking about basic things like screaming at each other and Ubediboron, ubehilucho, the way he talks, the way he walks. You sometimes listen to people and their mouth, it feels like the sanitation department didn't do a good job with them. Every other word they have, they're filler words, but they don't even mean anything. Right? If they were making a movie, there would be no speech. It would just be blip, 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 blip on the sheet. What kind of mouth is that? How could it be? I would say, you know a comedian is not funny if every other word he has to curse or say something inappropriate. Because if you really have content to yourself, you have no need for those fillers. It cannot be that you meet a Talmid Ḥacham and the words that come out of his mouth smell like the dumpster. The things that he talks about, I once had this. Once. I was running back in my days, I ran an organization in Israel for young women who couldn't live at home. There was a 2nd year, 3rd year program after they had gone to seminary. Home was not an option. They stayed on in Israel. I brought one of the teachers who today is a world-renowned speaker. And I thought it would be a good idea for them to listen to him at that point. And after the speech, every single one of the girls came to me and said, Vori, please don't ever bring him back. I said, why? They said his language is so vulgar. The topic he talked about is so obscene. Even if we're street kids, we don't speak that way. And that hurt. That hurt tremendously because this is somebody who marketed themselves as a Talmid Ḥacham, as somebody who's doing kiruv to bring people close, maybe a little too close. But it can't be. Because these kids who are on the street, their mind and their ears were cleaner than his mouth. They said, please don't ever bring him back again. And the way he walks, even the way a person works. You ever see somebody walk with dignity? You ever see, forgive me for the reference, when the Queen of England was alive? You ever saw the way she walked? She walked like she knows she's the queen. That's how she walked. Because she was the queen. It doesn't matter that she was the queen of nothing. But she was the queen. A Talmid Ḥacham, you see him, there's a certain way he walks. Ubemalbusho, uvekilkul devarav, the way he dresses. Now, I'm going to talk about in a minute the way he dresses. Because that has been misconstrued in many circles. The word is really bechil kul, like kalkalai, but I think like kalkala. The way, the way he behaves, yeah. ובמתנו, ויהיו כל המעשים האלו נעים ומתוקנים ביותר. And in the way he does, כן. And in the way he does business. Yeah, very important. The way he does business. If he's a huge Talmid Ḥacham and he's a great rabbi, and then you find out that he's involved in all kinds of scandals and he's busy stealing money from the people and from, then he's not a Ḥacham. It doesn't matter. Because how could it be that the way he does business is corruption? It just can't be. And the Rambam then takes apart the first paragraph, and divides it in more. I want to read to you the last of his, which is 13, and it's going to be, for those of you on Safari, just the last paragraph. He sums up, after he goes through all the details, he says, Klalot shel davar, the general rule. You min ha-nirdafim, v'lo min ha-rotfim. Min ha-ne'elavim, v'lo min ha-olvim. You want to sum up, I gave you a whole bunch of behaviors, but I can't cover all. I want to give you some general rules. Always be from the ones who are chaste and not the ones who are pursuing others, meaning the ones who are hurting others, who are running after them to do bad. Rather, you should be persecuted than the persecutor. Min ha-ne'elavim v'lo min ha-olvim. From the ones who get embarrassed and not from the ones who are brazen and mock everybody. V'adam shu oseh kol ha-ma'asim ha'elu v'chayotze bahen, alav ha-katuv omer, Vayomer li avdi ata, Yisrael asher becha etpaer. You want to understand what kind of complete human being? Be the humble person. If somebody's going to have to be stepped on, better you be stepped on than you step on everybody else. You want to make it to the top? Don't be like the politicians you see today, where there are a bunch of dead bodies on their whole trail. Because to make it to the top, you have to be corrupt. That's how it works. The Rambam says, no, quite the opposite. To be a sage, to be a real Talmid Ḥacham in the Jewish world, it means to have humility. It means that all your actions reflect a general attitude where you realize the people come first. I am a servant of the people. And if you'll do that, then when people see you on the street, what are they going to say? Yisrael, this is the kind of Jew, asher b'cha et pa'er. That I'm so, et pa'er? Et pa'ar. You're right, et pa'ar. I'm proud of you. That's a big deal. When somebody looks at you and says, wow, it makes sense they're Jewish, because that's how Jewish people act. And they mean it as a compliment and not as an insult. Oh, now you're Ḥacham. But just because you have knowledge and you learned a little more than somebody else, maybe that's step one to being a Talmid Ḥacham, but it doesn't make you a Talmid or Talmidat Ḥachamim. It's simply wonderful. Good for you. HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave you a brain. HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave you a good mouth. So what? If we don't internalize this, we are certainly not the prototype Ḥacham that we're looking for. I want to take you to, on that note, back to assimilation, where Ḥacham Fauer started us off. And he said the danger of assimilating is we don't even realize it. It happens so insidiously. I'll give you an example that you'll understand. There's a great article about the Grager. We'll talk about it during Purim time. You know what the Rashan is? Yeah? When they say Haman in some synagogues, they go, eh. The article talks about the origins of the Grager, and it's very obvious that they weren't Jewish. It was from the non-Jewish world that later the Jewish community adopted. The non-Jewish world stopped using. And now, decades later, it's the most Jewish item for Purim. That's what assimilation means. So much so that if you told somebody Jewish, look at the original Gragers, look at the original Rashan, you're going to see there's a little cross in the middle. You know why? Because it wasn't made for Jews. That's the point. They would tell you, God forbid, you're speaking such heresy. Why? Because they don't realize that they have been assimilated. They don't realize that something that was not once part of our culture slowly seeped its way in, has stayed here, and now has become the quintessential symbol of a holiday that's so much more than that. I want to read to you Ḥacham Fauer continues. He says, in such a situation, one may sport the longest beard, dress in flowing canonical robes, shake in all forms and directions, ramble ancient authorities, and yet under all the puffing and muffing, you will find a man whose coarse spiritual values and concepts of devotion are rooted in pagan religiosity. Says you're going to find that because we've taken the idea of what does it mean to be a Ḥacham. What does it mean to be a Ḥacham? You have a hat, you have a jacket, you have a beard. 3 things that the Rambam doesn't talk about. But because we've decided that this is what is a Ḥacham, if you were to take off the hat and to take off the beard and the jacket, more often than not, you find hiding under that costume is an ignorant fool who, if you pushed a little further, can you tell me more about the ancient teachings that you're rambling in gibberish? We would find that what they're marketing as Torah has nothing to do with the Torah. In fact, I believe it was Ovadia who once told me. He said, we were talking about Chassidut, and he said, I think only you could believe in the things you believe in because you probably never bumped into any other religion. And I said, you're right. It hurts to hear that, but you're right. Because really what's been marketed as the most Jewish value, you peel it away and you change the label and you realize, no, it's maybe just paganism remarketed, maybe a touch of Catholicism, and maybe a little touch of fill in the blank. But that's the danger. Because what we've done is instead of saying, no, the core has to be true. When I'm trying to evaluate who is a Ḥacham, I'm going to look at this book and this book only. And if it fits the criteria, it belongs in my class. It belongs in my repertoire. It belongs in my podcast list and my YouTube shorts and my Instagram account because I want to learn from a Ḥacham. But if it only looks like a Ḥacham because they're wearing the assimilated idea of what a rabbi is, that's very dangerous because you don't know who's hiding underneath that costume. And for all we know, what they're marketing, it's not just not Jewish values, it's a bunch of gibberish and lies and nonsense that's quite contrary to the Torah. On that note, I want to talk to you about one last story. Have to? Good. This is such a good story. Okay. Ḥacham Ford takes us on a journey. He shows you a case study of how a community and a people who have accepted the lie about what a Ḥacham looks like, when faced with a real Ḥacham, have no ability to say, oh, that's the real Ḥacham, and that's not, because the confusion is so great. I'm going to share afterwards. Yeah, I'll share afterwards. Okay. So he says, as the saying goes, the habit does not make the monk. Just like not everyone wearing a Stetson Grant hat and Durango boots is a cowboy. The other day I found my little Yair. He was wearing a cowboy hat. And when I asked, actually you asked him, my husband asked him, what are you doing? Are you helping? He said, no, I'm poking holes in the cereals. And he was wearing a cowboy hat. And in his mind, he was riding the cereals. And he had a pencil in his hand. And he was busy poking every single cereal until it doesn't make him a cowboy. In his 2-year-old mind, he's a cowboy. But that's about it. This view somehow does not seem to apply to the rabbinic world. For reasons better not discussed in public, analphabetic rabbis, or rabbis without Torah, roam freely, enjoying much fame and popularity, particularly among politicians and the semi-learned. Alerting about the fact that age and appearance are not good indicators of knowledge, the rabbi said, look not at the jug, but at that which is in it. Our Ḥachamim already warned us of this, that unfortunately the person who's not learned will always fall for the costume because it looks a certain way. That's why marketing works. But our Ḥachamim already told us, Al tistakel bakankan.
בקנקן, אלא במה שיש בו.
יפה, אבינו מן סבתא. Don't look at the jug, look at what's inside. Why? Yesh. Let us continue. Okay, for another time. Yep. Remember the continuation? Sometimes there's a new jug. Close. Sometimes there's a new jug that's full of old wine. And sometimes there's an old jug and has new wine in it. Right? Meaning, don't be deceived by the label. Look inside and verify is what's being presented accurate to what's inside? Given that bogus rabbis are always in some sort of mudsling contest, perennially fighting against something or someone, the rabbis taught us, rabbinic scholars increase peace in the world. Rather than by looks and clothing, a sage is distinguished by his high moral standard, impeccable manners, and personal habits. Ḥachamim knew already the problems that the fakers, the charlatans, would bring. And that's why they warned us, you want to know how to identify them? It's very simple. Look for the sages who bring peace. For the rabbis who are able to have so many different stripes and colors sit by their table, those are true leaders. The ones who can't even have their own children by their table because they're suing them in courts, can't be that's a real rabbi. Was I going to read about the willow and the bogus Talmid Chacham before? No. Okay. Those disregarding moral standards and civil discourse don't fit the bill, no matter how rabbinic they may appear. If you meet somebody and he looks like a rabbi and he talks like a rabbi, but then he breaks the law, he's not a rabbi. Yeah? I'm still, and forgive me, I'm going to be sensitive because there are kids in the room. It cannot be that every day I open my newsfeed and I see long beards and hats and long coats. Oh, and this one's now being tried in court for being a predator on this one. And so then you're not a rabbi. It doesn't matter, but for a rabbi, you're for sure not. Because your manners and your behaviors and your utter disregard of what civil law of human nature says is right and wrong, you're not a rabbi. The problem is the community over and over and again, unfortunately, falls for the trick. This situation was noted by an illustrious rabbinic leader, a Holocaust survivor, and a man of vast knowledge. Oh, okay, I'm going to continue. I want to read this story to you. Tov. He says, bogus rabbis in rabbinic gowns feel uncomfortable in the presence of other rabbis. They're imposters, so they're scared because if you're a real rabbi, you're very going to quickly be able to tell, I'm not. So it makes them really uncomfortable when there are other rabbis around. Some time ago, here's the story. Some time ago, I went to pay my respects to a friend who lost his father. There were a number of people, among them one of those individuals associated with a religious organization supported by the deceased. He had a white beard and was wearing one of those double-breasted long black jackets. He was not pleased with the fact that people addressed me as rabbi. So Ḥacham Devorah is coming to a shiva, and there's somebody who is an establishment rabbi, meaning he looks the part. Yeah, he has his long white beard, he's wearing a long coat with the double buttons, and he doesn't like that people are looking at Ḥacham Devorah and treating him like a rabbi. Why? Because Ḥacham Devorah didn't look like him. You understand? He asked permission to speak, and for about 15 minutes he lectured on the evils of assimilation, particularly of those rabbis who dress like goyim. It was obvious to all that he was referring to me. Okay, so here gets up the rabbi with a double-breasted coat, and for 15 minutes he's giving a speech out. Look, there are people who think they're rabbis and they dress like the non-Jews, and it's very obvious the whole time who's he trying to mock? Ḥacham Devorah. He was kind enough, however, not to point an accusing finger at me, probably because it would have proven to be a poor strategy for fundraising. Yeah. At the end of the sermon, he sat down. I waited until he was done and came to him. I assume that you are an outstanding Talmudist, I said. He smiled softly, as if to acquiesce to the indisputable, but not so obviously as to appear conceited. You know those fakers? Like, fake humility? Yeah. I think I'm the best in the world, but I can't tell you that because then it's going to look like I'm not humble, so I'm pretending. Can you tell us how you say lapel in Hebrew? Now, lapel is on those suit jackets that this big establishment rabbi is, so this part is the lapel. So Ḥacham Devorah says, could you tell me how you say this part of your outfit in Hebrew? The poor man was startled. He was not familiar with modern Hebrew and was trying frantically to fish for an equivalent term from rabbinical literature. Well, I said, what about double-breasted? Again, the poor man remained speechless. He could neither utter the words, I don't know, nor explode in a fit of ire, as that would be a poor public relation tactic. So Ḥacham Devorah is pushing him in the most gentle way. But this rabbi is getting very agitated because he doesn't have any good answers. In order not to prolong his agony, I said, one last question. Do you know how to say jacket in Hebrew? Before he could answer, I added, the truth is that these words do not exist in rabbinic Hebrew, simply because Jews never used to wear such garments. What you are wearing is also Gentile clothing. Now let me ask you, why is it all right for you to wear clothing according to the fashion of the late 19th century, but it is forbidden for others to dress according to the fashion of their own country and time? Somehow, he managed to mumble something about the special clothing of a rabbi. Do you know how Jewish law defines the rabbi's attire, I asked? Ḥacham, for in his brilliance, he didn't come yell at the rabbi that just shamed him publicly. He simply pushed him. He pushed him into a corner. And what he exposed is, oh, you rabbi with a long jacket, guess what? Your clothing is not either Jewish clothing. You know why? Because we don't even have words to call your clothing. Because up until we met the Polish aristocracy in the 19th century, this wasn't Jewish clothing. In fact, there's a great article, if you'd like, by Yussel Hausman. I believe it was in the Mishpacha magazine this summer about how did the clothing end up sticking to the Hasidim, but not to Lithuanians. This is not Jewish clothing. So how is it that you're allowed to somehow wear non-Jewish clothing from 1 century ago, but you mock everybody else who decides to wear a different century of non-Jewish clothing? And then he says, do you know what Jewish clothing is? What defines the rabbi's attire, I asked. He did not have the foggiest idea. In his boundless ignorance, he fancied that the way he and his peers dressed must be the proper rabbinic code of dressing. Well, Maimonides used 2 terms to define a sage's clothing. We read. Actually, we didn't. If you go a little bit more in the halachot about umalbushon and his clothing, the Rambam says 2 words. Na'ah, na'eh, v'naki. What does it mean? Very good. Pleasant. It should look appealing, not outlandish, and naki. You can't come with oil stains and, forgive me, dandruff on your lapels and different food. That's not called naki. Na'eh, pleasant. It should look beautiful. It should look nice. It should look becoming. I stopped for a second and then added, although some may deem your entire attire comely, few would argue that a jacket full of greasy spots is clean. And Ḥacham says, maybe some would say yours is na'eh. Maybe some wouldn't, because you look like you walked out of a storybook. I remember I once watched the movie, I think it's called Men in Stockings, maybe. And I said, oh, that's so funny. I know, I have an uncle that wears that. Turns out why many of the Hasidim that I grew up with on Shabbat, they wear, it looks like tights. It is stockings. They're white socks. They pull all the way up to knicker pants. You know what knicker pants are? They come right under your knee and you tie them with a little ribbon. And I remember thinking, aside for I grew up with it so it doesn't sound strange, I wonder if somebody bumps into this. Do they think this is na'eh? Or do they think we walked out of some Shakespeare play? Do they look at the clothing that we've dubbed as the rabbinic gear as na'eh? Or does it look like a clown's costume in 2026? Ḥacham says maybe something it's na'eh, but naki for sure what you're wearing is not. And with that he ends. He continues, and I want to read the last part. Except for professional Jews, those who make a living by being Jewish. He said, so most people, by working for political or religious organizations, most members of the Jewish faith treat each other horizontally, neither as superior nor as inferior, but as equals. In return, they expect reciprocity. And unless he or she happens to be one of those professional Jews, she or he will treat no other either as superior or inferior. He says it's an interesting phenomenon that aside for the Jews who their profession is Judaism, so fill in the blank, the rabbi, the shamash, the chazan, the Hebrew day school teacher, normal people, when we bump into each other, we treat each other as equal. You're not better. You're not worse. You're not my competition. I have no need, like by Rabbi Shmuel HaNagid. He meets a rabbi who he thinks is a lunatic. But because he's a decent human being, he greets him with the warmth that any normal person does. But this Jewish professional, what is his response to Rabbi Shmuel HaNagid? What do you want from me? Why interrupting my class? We're not enemies. No, but we are enemies because they view everything as vertical. You're either above me or below me, and I have to make sure you're below me. Many professional Jews, whether religious or secular, especially politicians, are not aware of the simple fact. Jews, as well as non-Jews, don't care for people in the habit of speaking down to the other. Yeah, oddly enough, most people, we don't like to be talked down upon. I don't want you to berate me and tell me what an awful human being I am and then ask me for a check. Doesn't usually work that way. Doesn't make me feel kind and fuzzy and pleasant when every time we talk, somehow you make me know that you're a better human being than me. In the words of Rabbi Yechiel Mechel Weinberg, he writes, I think that spiritual purification and the raising of our moral standards would be a positive first step for Jewish success both in Israel and abroad. After all, if God came down to Mount Sinai to speak to the people, why should it be that men and women who are supported by our taxes and our contributions cannot do the same? You see, if HaKadosh Baruch Hu could come down to us, so could those who are in the leadership position. And I want to end with a thought, which is, we're going to now take the next eternity to talk about Ḥachamim. And it's very clear to us which Ḥachamim we're not going to talk about. The one that Rabbi Shemuel HaNagid bumped into, that was braying like a donkey, that he thought was vandalizing the Beit HaKnesset only to open the doors, and to his utter dismay, see that this is some rabbi who doesn't know how to read, is screaming at his students, who in turn are doing some crazy outlandish motions, all under the guise of Torah. That's not the kind of Ḥachamim we're looking for. The kind of Ḥachamim we're looking for, the Rambam already told us what the litmus test is. We go back to our Hilchot Deot, chapter 5, and we look. And every one that we bump into, we say, do they fit this criteria? Because if they do, then of course I want to learn from them. Because of course I want to learn from the people who are marbin shalom ba'olam. They increase peace, they increase wisdom, they will make me a better human being. Not because they yell and scream and stamp their feet and break my phone, but because in the words of Ḥacham, with gentle persuasion, they come talk to me. They have words of insight to share with me. Those are the Ḥachamim that I want to talk to you about. And I'm going to end off with that on this note. Next week, Be'ezrat Hashem, we're going to talk about much more logistics. So I'm going to give you maps, and I'm going to give you time eras, and we're going to plumb through those so that we can map out where geographically we're talking about. And then when I come back from Seattle, Be'ezrat Hashem, we're going to then jump headfirst in to our first Ḥacham. Until then, I want to wish you a wonderful night. A Laila Tov. Thank you for learning with me.